As we come to the end of week 2, we're heading into week 3, and in week 3 we are thinking through the concept or the biblical practice of lamenting. I cited in one of the beginning discussion threads that as you consider the psalmists in that whole section, there are 3 ways you can look at the Psalms. First is orientation, second is disorientation, and third, it would be reorientation. I like that schematic thinking through the outline as we interpret the book of the Psalms, because that's where the psalmist is rightly at. He's crying out to the Lord in the midst of his distress. There's that disorientation. And so I think most of us are in that realm right there. We're crying out to the Lord. We're asking God to help. And there are seasons where things are going okay. And so it was in the life of Job. And then all of a sudden disaster hits, calamity strikes, and he's in the midst of disorientation and trying to figure out, okay, God, where are you in the midst of all this? He reasons and he understands that the Lord is the one who gives and takes away. That's his declaration. The same is true for the psalmists as they come to grips with their trial, with maybe an enemy is after them. Or even the psalmist says, my foot was almost slipped, but God, you rescued me and placed me on solid rock. And so you see this psalmist, the writers, all of them move from orientation. They know who God is. God is faithful. God is loving. God is just. God is kind and is compassionate. And he's faithful to the generations. So they know this. They know this to be true. But then in the midst of their trial, in the midst of their suffering, in the midst of their pain, they cry out. And that's the whole aspect of lamenting, crying out as a spiritual practice in the life of the church. How might it be modeled? How might it be applied even in our lives? And is there even a place within the construct of the local church? And I would suspect that there are some churches that do a really good job at listening and counseling others and coming alongside and doing the hard work of lifting each other's burdens and carrying each other's burdens and knowing that Jesus is ultimately the one who carries our burdens through his death and on a cross. And so he tells us, cast our burdens upon you. We go back to this whole aspect of the psalmists crying out to the Lord in the midst of their suffering, in the midst of their pain. And so there's orientation. He's familiar with God's character. There's disorientation. I'm in the midst of my suffering. I'm in the midst of my pain. And then he moves toward the end of the psalm, and he moves back to this acquaintance of knowing who God is. And that's reorientation. He realizes God is faithful, God is merciful, God is kind, and he will carry out his promises in the life of the worshiper. And so that's the thrust of this week. You also might want to go through the book of Lamentation. Is also another helpful book to see how Israel cried out to God in the midst of suffering and pain, and juxtaposition both Lamentation and the book of Psalms together and see how there might be some unique similarities between the writers as they cry out to God in the midst of their pain and suffering. Well, I hope this clarifies the direction of week 3 and where we're heading. And as you can see, the bookend approach to bookend, that God wrote a story and he's bringing about his redemptive plan through each page of the book of the Bible.